In the summer of 1941, while the German armies advanced eastward as if the entire world were about to yield before them, a group of SS officials began to discuss behind closed doors in Berlin, Lublin, and Poznan something humanity had never attempted before: the systematic, industrialized, and geographically coordinated murder of all the Jews of Europe. Not of a city, not of a country, of an entire continent. It is estimated that at the moment the plans were set in motion, Nazi planners spoke of 11 million people. By the end of the war, between 5 and 6 million had been murdered. What makes this episode something qualitatively different from any other mass crime in history is not only the number, it is the architecture. The Nazis built an amboged bureaucracy for death, with railway lines, administrative forms, private companies, patent engineers, and even a detailed accounting of the goods confiscated from the victims. Richard Kocher, the personal statistician of Heinrich Himmler, drafted a report on March 23, 1943, in which he precisely listed the number of Jews evacuated: 1,873,539 people. The report was printed in large letters because Hitler had vision problems, and it was delivered to him on the eve of his 54th birthday. What is narrated below is the story of that machinery seen from the inside, from the offices of the perpetrators, from the platforms where the trains arrived full and departed empty, from the records of a system that operated for years before the outside world fully understood what was happening. It is not the story of the victims, although they are at the center of everything. It is the story of how the Germans designed, financed, built, and operated the largest extermination infrastructure the world has ever known. The ideology that made it possible: the long road to hatred. To understand how an extermination machine works, one must first understand the fuel that drives it. Nazi anti-Semitism did not emerge out of nowhere in 1933. It was the final point, the most radical and lethal, of a tradition of intolerance that stretched back centuries in Europe. The historian Raoul Hilberg summarized it in a three-stage framework. First, the Church sought to convert the Jews to Christianity. When this failed, it expelled and segregated them. When that also failed, Nazism took the most extreme conclusion of all. The words, as Hilberg articulated them, resonate with the relentless logic of a progression. The missionaries of Christianity had said, "You have no right to live among us as Jews." The secular rulers who followed them proclaimed, "You have no right to live among us." The Nazis, in the end, decreed, "You have no right to live." In 1933, the approximately 530,000 Jews of Germany represented less than 1% of a population of 67 million people. They were integrated. They spoke German, considered themselves German, had fought in the trenches of the First World War. About 100,000 served in the armed forces of the Kaiserreich. Between 30,000 and 35,000 received decorations for bravery. About 12,000 died in combat. Of the 38 Nobel Prizes won by German writers and scientists between 1905 and 1936, 14 were awarded to Jews. They were not foreigners. They were part of the cultural fabric of the country. What Hitler and the Nazi Party achieved was something psychologically prodigious: to convince a highly educated and culturally sophisticated nation that this perfectly integrated minority constituted an existential threat. To achieve this, Joseph Goebbels, appointed head of the Reich Ministry for Public Enlightenment and Propaganda in March 1933, deployed an unprecedented propaganda machine. Images, films, posters, schoolbooks, and radio speeches hammered the same message for years. The Jew was the opposite of the German. Aryan was the parasite, the conspirator, the internal traitor. The propaganda established a visual vocabulary that operated on the German collective unconscious, associating the Aryan with beauty and nobility, and the Jews with ugliness, dishonesty, and destruction. But propaganda alone was not enough. What transformed hatred into public policy was an incremental and cumulative legislation that normalized each step before taking the next. During the first 6 years of the Nazi regime, between 1933 and the beginning of the war in 1939, Jews felt the effects of more than 400 decrees and regulations that restricted every aspect of their public and private life. First, the boycott of April 1st, 1933, when SA and SS patrols blocked access to thousands of Jewish businesses and painted Stars of David in yellow and black on doors and windows. Then, less than a week later, the law for the restoration of the professional civil service, which forced the resignation of Jewish officials. Year by year, decree by decree, Jews were expelled from higher education, from the liberal professions, from culture, from the military, from commerce. The Nuremberg Laws, promulgated on September 15, 1935, during the annual Congress of the Nazi Party in that city, represented a qualitative rupture. The Reich citizenship law established that only those with German or kindred blood could be citizens of the Reich. Jews were reduced to subjects of the state. The law for the protection of German blood and German honor prohibited marriages and sexual relations between Jews and non-Jews, defining the latter as racial defilement. For the first time in history, it was not a person's faith that determined their legal status, but the origin of their grandparents. The result was that tens of thousands of people who did not identify as Jews, practicing Catholics, Protestants, even priests and nuns, found themselves overnight stripped of their citizenship, classified as Jews according to a racial definition that even Nazi scientists themselves could not substantiate biologically, because, as was demonstrated, there was no physical marker, no detectable genetic characteristic that distinguished a Jew from a non-Jew. The Nazi racial definition was, in practice, a religious definition applied 2 generations back. Hanne Hirsch-Liebmann, born in November 1924 in the German city of Karlsruhe, lived this process from the inside. Her father Max was a photographer. When he died in 1925, her mother Ella continued the studio. In April 1933, our studio, like the other Jewish businesses in Karlsruhe, was covered with signs during the anti-Semitic boycott. "Do not buy from Jews," she would later recall. The studio remained open, producing the mandatory photographs for the new identity documents marked with the letter J that all Jews were required to carry, until December 31, 1938, when all Jewish businesses were forced to close. The night of November 9th to 10th, 1938 marked the point of no return. Known as the Night of Broken Glass, or Kristallnacht, it was the first mass pogrom organized by the Nazi state on German soil. The SS, the SA, and the Hitler Youth destroyed more than 250 synagogues, including some of the most magnificent Jewish houses of worship in Europe, and thousands of ritual objects of incalculable historical value. They attacked businesses, homes, and cemeteries. At least 91 Jews were murdered. Orders from Gestapo headquarters instructed the German police to arrest some 30,000 Jewish men and intern them in concentration camps. Hundreds died in the days and weeks that followed. To compound the insult, the Nazi government blamed the Jews themselves for the pogrom and imposed on them a fine of 1 billion Reichsmarks, the equivalent of $400 million in 1938, to pay for the damages. The logic of this escalation was transparent to those who wanted to see it. Each wave of violence was followed by a new wave of legislation, and each new legislation normalized what had previously seemed inconceivable, preparing the ground for the next step. By the end of 1938, German Jews had their driver's licenses revoked, their financial assets frozen, were banned from attending schools and universities, cinemas, theaters, and sports facilities. In many cities, they were forbidden to enter parks designated as Aryan zones or to sit on certain benches. Between 1933 and 1939, Nazi policy forced approximately half of the Jewish population of Germany and more than 2/3 of Austrian Jews to emigrate. But those who left found a world that did not want them. In July 1938, the Evian Conference, convened by President Franklin D. Roosevelt with the apparent intention of finding a solution to the problem of Jewish refugees, brought together 33 nations in the French spa town of Evian-les-Bains. Their representatives all acknowledged the gravity of the situation and, one after another, offered excuses for not opening their doors. Only the Dominican Republic offered concrete help, accepting the entry of 100,000 Jews. The rest looked the other way. Adolf Hitler commented with sarcasm, "I can only hope that the other world, which shows so much sympathy for these criminals, will at least be generous enough to convert that sympathy into practical help." The refusal of the world to receive the Jews provided the Nazi regime with additional justification for the measures that would follow. The mobile killing fields, the Einsatzgruppen in the east. On June 22, 1941, Nazi Germany violated the Non-Aggression Pact with the Soviet Union and launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in history. More than 3 million German soldiers crossed the border in a dawn that would forever change the character of the war. And with them, following in the footsteps of the army, advanced 4 special units of the SS and the police, the Einsatzgruppen, the Mobile Operations Groups. There were 4 of these groups, designated Einsatzgruppe A, B, C, and D, which operated in distinct geographic sectors along the Eastern Front. Einsatzgruppe A operated in the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, alongside Army Group North. B operated in Belarus, alongside Army Group Center. C acted in central Ukraine with Army Group South. D covered southern Ukraine and Crimea. Each Einsatzgruppe was composed of several smaller Einsatzkommandos and Sonderkommandos with an initial total strength of about 3,000 men. Before the Eastern Campaign ended, they would be reinforced to reach around 15,000 personnel. The mission of the Einsatzgruppen was formulated in ideological terms to eliminate the racial and political enemies of the Reich in the newly conquered territories. This meant, in practice, the murder of communist officials, commissars of the Soviet army, people with mental and intellectual disabilities, and Jews. But the scale of the violence expanded with a speed that surprised even some within the SS itself. Initially, the Einsatzgruppen primarily executed Jewish men of military age. But by the end of July 1941, after Himmler personally visited the front and clarified his expectations, the orders were extended to the extermination of entire Jewish communities, men, women, and children, without exception of age or sex. The modus operandi was always essentially the same. The units arrived at a town or village, surrounded the Jewish quarter, and ordered the entire population to gather in a square or designated place. They were told they would be resettled. They were ordered to leave behind documents of value, clothing, personal belongings. They were then led in columns, on foot or by truck to the outskirts of the town, where trenches had often been dug or natural ravines existed. They were forced to undress and move to the edge in groups. The machine guns did the rest. At the end of the day, the bodies were covered with a thin layer of earth, sometimes so thin that the pressure of decomposition pushed the bodies to the surface days later. Babi Yar, a ravine located on the outskirts of Kiev in Ukraine, became the most well-known symbol of this massacre. The Germans took Kiev on September 19, 1941. 10 days later, they posted notices ordering all the Jews of the city to assemble on September 29th on Melnik Street with warm clothing and valuable documents supposedly to be relocated. Those who did not comply would be executed. Entire families, from newborns to the elderly, followed the instructions without suspecting what awaited them. They were led toward the Jewish cemetery and to the entrance of the ravine, which was fenced with barbed wire and guarded by Germans and Ukrainian auxiliary police. As the Jews approached the edge, they were forced to hand over their valuables, remove all their clothing, and move toward the precipice in groups of 10. Upon reaching the edge, the SS and the police machine-gunned them with automatic weapons. At the end of the day, the bodies were covered with earth. In 2 days of shooting, Germans and their auxiliaries had killed more than 33,000 Jews. In the following months, thousands more were murdered at Babi Yar, including Roma and Soviet prisoners of war. The total number of dead at that site is estimated at 100,000 people. The German civil administrator of the Belarusian city of Slutsk documented one of these operations and reported it to his superiors with visible disturbance. As far as the manner in which this action was carried out is concerned, it is with the deepest regret that I must state that it bordered on the sadistic, he wrote. The Jewish population, but also non-Jewish Belarusians, were taken from their homes and assembled with indescribable brutality by German police officials and in particular by Lithuanian partisans. Shots could be heard throughout the city, and the bodies of executed Jews were piling up in the streets. These men of the Einsatzgruppen were not for the most part low-level ideological fanatics. Many of their leaders held university degrees. Some were doctors of law and science. Sturmbannführer Herbert Lange, who operated in the annexed Polish territories, had already accumulated experience killing patients in psychiatric institutions through the use of vans with exhaust redirected into a sealed compartment. This technology, the mobile gas chamber, would soon be scaled up to an industrial level. But during the summer and autumn of 1941, the solution was still improvised, costly in psychological terms for the executioners, and extraordinarily visible to the local populations. The reports from the Einsatzgruppen commanders themselves that reached Berlin contained routine statistics of extermination. In August to November 1942, Himmler's report number 51, which reached Hitler with a marginal note confirming that he had read it, reported that in southern Russia, Ukraine, and the Bialystok district, 363,211 Jews had been executed during that period, classified as bandits and bandit auxiliaries. It was not a secret note among spies. It was a routine statistical report written in the normal bureaucratic language of the SS, presented to the supreme leader of the Reich in the format of an executive summary. The problem with the Einsatzgruppen method, from the perspective of Nazi planners, was multiple. First, it was slow. Killing by shooting in open pits, although devastatingly efficient by previous standards of massacre, proved insufficient for the total scale of the project, 11 million people across all of Europe. Second, it was psychologically costly for the executioners. SS commanders themselves reported cases of nervous breakdowns, severe alcoholism, and other weaknesses among their men. Himmler personally attended a mass execution in Minsk in August 1941 and was visibly disturbed by the spectacle, to the point that he commissioned his experts to find methods that would be more humane for the executioners themselves. Third, it was visible. Open-air massacres could not be hidden from local populations, nor could the spread of information be prevented. Finally, it was geographically limited. It could not be exported to Western Europe, where democratic traditions and the presence of international media made that type of operation impossible. The solution to all these problems would be the creation of what Nazi records euphemistically called liquidation centers, the extermination camps. The laboratory of horror, euthanasia as a dress rehearsal. Before Auschwitz, Treblinka, or Belzec existed, the Nazis had already built and operated a secret infrastructure of mass murder on German soil. The Action T4 program, named after the address of its central office, Tiergartenstrasse 4 in Berlin, was the first campaign of systematic extermination in Nazi history. And it functioned as the testing laboratory that would make everything that followed possible. The program was personally authorized by Hitler in a letter retroactively dated to September 1939, the same date as the beginning of the war under whose cover it was launched, although the operation in fact began in the autumn of that year. Its stated objective was the elimination of people with mental and physical disabilities, whom Nazi vocabulary classified as lives unworthy of being lived, lebensunwürdiges Leben. Doctors and directors of psychiatric institutions throughout the Reich were ordered to fill out questionnaires about their patients. The questionnaires were evaluated by committees of physicians who determined who should live and who should die. The man chosen to direct the killing operations was Christian Wirth, a police official from Stuttgart who would become a key figure in the extermination camps of Operation Reinhard. One of his supervisors, Victor Brack from the Führer Chancellery, was the technical architect of the system. The first executions in January 1940 were carried out with carbon monoxide in a test facility located in a former penal hospital in Brandenburg, Germany. A room was built designed to resemble a shower with tiled walls and fake shower heads in the ceiling, but which was in fact hermetically sealed and equipped with ducts through which lethal gas was injected. Christian Wirth observed the first execution of the program from a window as 8 patients were killed in the gas chamber at Brandenburg using carbon monoxide. The efficiency of the method was considered satisfactory. The Brandenburg gas chamber entered regular service, and soon other similar facilities were built at the sanatoriums of Grafeneck in Württemberg, Hartheim in Austria, Sonnenstein in Saxony, Bernburg and Hadamar. In total, 6 gassing installations operated on Reich territory. To ensure discretion, the bodies were immediately incinerated in adjacent crematoria, and families received false notifications stating that their relatives had died of natural causes. But the program was so large, it eventually eliminated about 70,000 people in its first phase alone, that it proved impossible to keep it completely secret. Communities near the facilities could see the black smoke from the ovens. Neighbors knew. The Bishop of Münster, Clemens August von Galen, publicly denounced the program in August 1941. Public pressure within Germany was sufficient for Hitler to order the formal suspension of gas operations in the Reich that same month. But the program did not die. It was simply moved eastward, out of reach of German public opinion. The technical personnel trained in T4, the operators of gas chambers, the engineers who built the installations, the doctors who supervised the procedures, were recruited for a new mission in Poland. Their expertise would become the operational foundation of the extermination camps. And the technology they had perfected, gas as a method of mass murder, chambers designed to resemble hygiene facilities, forms and bureaucratic records of death, would be adapted and applied on an incomparably larger scale. Worth and his men took with them not only the technology but also the administrative logic, the same euphemistic terminology, the same system of false notifications, the same bureaucratic detachment between order and execution. Someone signed a paper, someone built a structure, someone operated the machinery. No one within the administrative chain needed to confront the full reality of what was being done. The first camp, Chelmno and the death trucks. In the last weeks of November 1941, Herbert Lang's vans began traveling the secondary roads of the Warthegau, the Polish territory annexed to the Reich with its capital in Poznan, in search of a suitable location. Lange already had experience. Between the autumn of 1939 and the summer of 1941, his special unit, the Sonderkommando Lange, had operated from Poznan, killing psychiatric patients by carbon monoxide poisoning in sealed vans. He had used the same technology against Jews in small experimental actions in the Warthegau during the autumn of 1941. Now he had been assigned a mission of completely different proportions. The chosen site was a mansion in the village of Chelmno nad Nerem, about 80 kilometers northwest of Łódź, surrounded by dense forests and sufficiently isolated from population centers. In early December 1941, Lange's unit, reinforced and expanded, moved from Poznan to Chelmno and began operations. It initially had 2 gas vans. A third arrived during the month, sent from Berlin. The mechanism was brutally simple. The victims, mostly Jews, brought from the Łódź ghetto or from the towns of the Warthegau, arrived at the mansion courtyard under the promise of being resettled. There, they were instructed to undress and hand over their valuables under the pretext of disinfection before transport. They were then led through a wooden corridor that took them into one of the sealed vans, with a capacity of about 50 people. When the vehicle was full, the doors were hermetically sealed and the exhaust pipe was redirected to inject carbon monoxide directly inside. The van started and drove for about 16 kilometers toward the nearby forests, where the prisoners, who were dying during the journey, were unloaded by Jews forced to serve as gravediggers in previously dug pits. These gravediggers would in turn be killed and replaced regularly. Yakov Grojanowski, one of the few members of these squads who managed to escape and provide testimony, described what the German guards did when a baby or very small child had survived the journey because it had been wrapped in clothing by its mother. The guards would grab them and smash them against nearby trees. The pace of operations at Chelmno reached up to 1,000 killings per day. The 3 gas vans could each kill 50 people simultaneously on every trip. In total, during the first phase of its operations, between December 1941 and July 1944, Chelmno was responsible for more than 360,000 deaths, the vast majority Jews, but also about 4,400 Roma from the Łódź ghetto. No known survivors of the gassing process exist. The question of whether the order to begin operations at Chelmno came directly from Berlin or emerged from local initiatives in the Warthegau has been the subject of historical debate. What the documents establish clearly is that the local power structure, Gauleiter Arthur Greiser and the SS and police leader Wilhelm Kopper, both central figures in the administration of the Warthegau, was fully aware and actively complicit. Greiser, born in the province of Posen in 1897, was known for his ruthless determination to make his region the Nazi model Gau. Kopper, born in Hildesheim in 1896, effectively controlled deportation policy in the province and had a privileged relationship with Himmler. In July 1941, months before operations at Chelmno began, the head of the security service, SD, in Poznan, SS Sturmbannführer Rolf-Heinz Höppner, had sent a memorandum to Adolf Eichmann in the Reich Security Main Office describing internal deliberations about what to do with the Jews of the Warthegau who could not be fed during the winter. "There is a danger that this winter it will no longer be possible to feed all the Jews," Höppner wrote. "The question must be seriously considered whether the most humane solution would not be to finish off those Jews incapable of work by some kind of rapid action preparation. This would in any case be more pleasant than letting them starve to death." Höppner ended his note with a revealing sentence. "Things sound partly fantastic, but in my opinion they would be perfectly implementable." He was right. 4 months later, Chelmno was operational. The Wannsee Conference, when bureaucracy planned genocide. On November 29, 1941, Reinhard Heydrich, head of the Reich Main Security Office, RSHA, and one of the most powerful men in the SS apparatus, sent a series of formal invitations to senior officials from various ministries and state and party institutions. He summoned them to a coordination meeting. The meeting was initially scheduled for December 9, 1941, but was postponed when news of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor forced Hitler to convene a session of the Reichstag. The new date was January 20, 1942. The location, a villa on the shores of Lake Wannsee in the Berlin suburb of the same name. 15 men sat around that table. They represented the Ministry of the Interior, the Ministry of Justice, the Foreign Ministry, the Party Chancellery, the administration of the general government in Poland, the SS, and the party in the occupied Eastern Territories. More than half held doctoral degrees. Heydrich opened the meeting by recalling that Field Marshal Göring had tasked him, on July 31, 1941, with preparing the overall solution of the Jewish question in the German sphere of influence in Europe. He proceeded to explain how far the planning had already advanced. Heydrich then enumerated the Jewish population of each European country, including nations outside Germany's direct sphere of influence. 4,000 Jews in Ireland, 3,000 in Portugal, 8,000 in Sweden, 18,000 in Switzerland. The mention of these neutral countries carried a clear implication for those listening. At some future point, it was expected that these governments would be pressured to hand over their Jewish populations. In total, Heydrich estimated that the final solution would encompass about 11 million European Jews. The language used at the meeting was deliberately euphemistic. It spoke of evacuation to the east, of labor deployment in road construction, of natural reduction. But Adolf Eichmann, who drafted the minutes of the conference, later admitted, during his trial in Jerusalem in 1961, that the conversation had been far more explicit. The participants had spoken of killing in very direct words, totally incompatible with legal language. At the end of the meeting, the participants stood drinking cognac, congratulating each other on a successful working day. Heydrich sat by the fireplace with Eichmann and Heinrich Müller, head of the Gestapo. Eichmann would later recall seeing Heydrich smoking and drinking cognac, something he had not seen him do in years. What the Wannsee Conference was not, according to historical consensus, was the meeting where the decision to exterminate European Jews was taken. That decision had already been made, gradually and without a single identifiable decree, in the preceding months. What Wannsee coordinated was the logistical machinery, which ministry was responsible for which aspect, how deportations were structured, what exceptions, if any, would be granted to mixed-race Jews or decorated war veterans. Wannsee was, in essence, a project management meeting. The project was the Holocaust. 30 copies of the minutes were distributed to various officials after the meeting. Heydrich noted that, fortunately, the basic line regarding the practical implementation of the final solution of the Jewish question had been established. Joseph Goebbels, upon reading his copy, wrote in his diary, "The Jewish question must now be resolved on a pan-European scale." On January 31, 1942, 11 days after Wannsee, Eichmann issued new deportation orders. Operation Reinhard. 3 death factories. On October 13, 1941, even before the Wannsee Conference, Heinrich Himmler had met with Odilo Globoknik, the SS and police leader in Lublin, and had given him verbal instructions to immediately begin the construction of an extermination camp in Belzec. The order preceded Wannsee by 3 months. The decision to build mass killing centers in the territory of the General Government of Poland did not wait for any formal conference. Globoknik was an Austrian Nazi. His deep anti-Semitism had earned him a conviction for the murder of a Jew in 1933. He had been appointed regional leader of Vienna after the Anschluss, but in January 1939 he was demoted for currency speculation. Himmler, however, did not lose sight of him and appointed him to the position in Lublin in November 1939. In 1940, Globoknik had built a small economic empire based on Jewish slave labor, and in July 1941 he commissioned the construction of a huge labor camp in Majdanek. For Operation Reinhard, the name by which the extermination operation in the general government would become known in honor of Heydrich himself, who was assassinated in an attack in May 1942, Globoknik recruited a large number of people from the former Action T4, including Christian Wirth himself. They continued to be paid by the headquarters of the euthanasia program in the Führer Chancellery in Berlin, although they obeyed Globoknik's orders. Almost all of the 20 or 30 SS personnel employed in each of the camps that Globoknik established came from that group of T4 veterans. Belzec, the first operational camp. The construction of the first of the Operation Reinhard camps began on November 1, 1941, on the site of a former labor camp near the village of Belzec in eastern Poland, under the supervision of a euthanasia operative who later remained as Wirth's assistant when he was appointed camp commander in December 1941. A railway spur was built connecting directly to Belzec station. There were houses for the SS, barracks for a small number of long-term prisoners, shoemakers, tailors, carpenters who would work for the SS, and quarters for Ukrainian auxiliaries recruited from prisoner-of-war camps. The gas chambers were built of wood, hermetically sealed, and equipped with pipes through which exhaust gas from automobile engines was pumped. Wirth chose this system because cylinders of pure carbon monoxide used in Action T4 were difficult to obtain in large quantities and could arouse suspicion in victims who saw them. By February 1942, the facilities were ready. They were tested on small groups of Jews. Then the Jewish workers who had helped build them were also gassed. On March 17, 1942, the first deportees arrived at the camp and were gassed immediately upon arrival. In the following 4 weeks, 75,000 Jews had been murdered, including 30,000 of the 37,000 inhabitants of the Lublin ghetto, and others from various regions of the general government. Franz Stangl, an Austrian SS officer who later played a central role in Operation Reinhard, described what he saw when he visited Belzec in the spring of 1942. I arrived by car. Upon arrival, one first reached the Belzec railway station on the left side of the road. The camp was on the same side, but uphill. The commandant's office was 200 meters away, on the other side of the road. It was a single-story building. The smell, my God, the smell, it was everywhere. Wirth was not in his office. I remember I was taken to him. He was standing on a hill next to the pits. The pits, full, they were full. I can't tell you, not hundreds, thousands of corpses. One of the pits had overflowed. They had put too many corpses in, and decomposition had progressed too quickly, so that the liquid from below had pushed the bodies on top upward and over the edge, and the corpses had rolled down the hill. The first gas chambers at Belzec were rudimentary wooden constructions that broke down constantly, leaving deportees waiting for days without food or water. Many died. Finally, in June 1942, even this became intolerable for Wirth, who temporarily halted the transports and demolished the wooden chambers, replacing them with a concrete structure that contained 6 gas chambers with a total capacity of 2,000 people simultaneously. The new installation became operational in mid-July 1942, and transports continued arriving until mid-December of that year. By the end of 1942, around 414,000 people had been murdered at Belzec. The total may have reached 600,000. Only 2 people are known to have survived Belzec. Sobibor, the second installation. The second camp of Operation Reinhard was built near the village of Sobibor in an area where until then there had only been a small labor camp for Jewish women. Construction began in March 1942 but was delayed, so Worth appointed Franz Stangl as camp commander with the specific task of completing construction on time. By mid-May 1942, the gas chambers were ready. They were brick structures, each with a capacity of 100 people who were killed using engine exhaust gases pumped in from the outside. The camp was built following the model of Biušek, with administrative and reception areas near the railway spur, and the extermination area at some distance out of sight, accessible through a narrow fenced passage 150 meters long, known by the SS as the Tube. Behind the gas chamber building there were burial pits. A small trolley track connected the railway line with the pits to transport the bodies of those who had died during the journey. Stangl ran the camp with efficiency according to his own code. Elegantly dressed, wearing a white riding jacket, dark trousers and high boots, he usually carried a riding crop, although according to his own later testimony he did not personally use it. At Sobibor, within the first 3 months of operation, nearly 100,000 Jews from Lublin, Austria, the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia and the Altreich, Germany within its pre-1938 borders, had been murdered. In total, nearly 250,000 victims were killed at Sobibor before the camp was closed. The summer heat of 1942 caused the layers of compacted bodies buried in the pits to begin swelling and emerging to the surface, as had happened in Biušek, producing a terrible stench and attracting large numbers of rats and other scavengers. The camp's water supply, drawn from wells, began to taste putrid. The wells were being contaminated by the decomposition of corpses. The camp administration ordered a large pit to be built, filled it with wood and set it on fire. A mechanical excavator was brought in to exhume the corpses, which were placed on grates above the pit and cremated by a Jewish Sonderkommando whose members were themselves to be killed once they had finished the work. On October 14, 1943, the prisoners of the Sobibor Sonderkommando, among whom there were Soviet war veterans hardened in combat, organized a rebellion. They lured most of the SS personnel in the camp into the workshops under various pretexts and killed them with daggers and axes without alerting the guards in the watchtowers. They cut the telephone cables and the camp's electrical supply. When they attempted to break through toward the main gate, the Ukrainian guards opened fire with automatic weapons and many were killed. Others managed to break through the perimeter fence. Some fell into the outer minefield, but more than 300 out of 600 inmates managed to escape from the camp. About 100 of the fugitives were recaptured and shot almost immediately. The rest managed to evade capture, and some eventually found their way to partisan units. Shortly afterward, a new contingent of Jewish prisoners arrived to dismantle the camp. The buildings were demolished, trees were planted, a farm was built, and when the work was finished, the Jews were forced to lie down on the cremation grates and were shot one by one. After December 1943, no one remained in the camp, and all visible traces had disappeared. Treblinka, the deadliest. The third of the Operation Reinhard camps was located at Treblinka, northeast of Warsaw, in a remote wooded area at the end of a single-track branch line leading to a former quarry from Małkinia station on the main Warsaw-Białystok railway line. In the spring of 1941, the German occupiers had opened a labor camp there to extract materials for fortifications on the German-Soviet border in Poland. A year later, the SS selected that site for a new extermination camp. Construction began in early June 1942, supervised by Richard Tomala, the same SS officer who had built Sobibor. The system at Treblinka followed the pattern established in the other Operation Reinhard camps, but with refinements based on accumulated experience. There was a railway spur and a station from which arriving Jews were taken to a disrobing hall near the ghetto where long-term prisoners lived. Once there, the naked Jews were quickly led through a narrow fenced passage, known by the SS as the Road to Heaven, Himmelstrasse, toward a large brick building carefully hidden in the upper part of the camp. This building contained 3 gas chambers into which the victims were driven in screaming and under insults to be killed by diesel engine fumes pumped through a system of pipes. Behind the building there was a set of trenches, each 50 meters long, 25 meters wide and 10 meters deep, dug with a mechanical excavator. The Sonderkommandos pushed the bodies in small wagons along a narrow-gauge railway and dumped them into the trenches, which were covered with earth when full. As in Sobibor, the Jews who arrived were told they had come to a transit camp and that they would receive clean clothes and have their valuables kept in custody after passing through a disinfection shower. Initially, about 5,000 Jews or more arrived each day, but by mid-August 1942, the pace of the killings accelerated, and by the end of that month, 312,000 Jews, not only from Warsaw but also from Radom and Lublin, had been gassed at Treblinka. Barely 2 months had passed since the first gassings at the camp on July 23, 1942. The first camp commander, Irmfried Ebel, was an Austrian doctor who had worked in Action T4. He had ambitiously declared that his goal was to surpass any other camp in the number of killings. But the trains arrived without ventilation and without water or sanitation, and thousands died during the journey in the summer heat. The pressure of numbers was such that all pretense of order was abandoned. Oskar Berger, who arrived on a transport on August 22, 1942, described hundreds of bodies lying everywhere on the platform, piles of bundles, clothes, suitcases, all mixed together. SS soldiers, Germans and Ukrainians were on the roofs of the barracks, shooting indiscriminately at the crowd. Men, women and children fell bleeding. The air was filled with screams and cries. The survivors were led to the gas chambers by SS men who beat them with whips and iron bars. In order for their screams not to be heard by those waiting below, the SS installed a small orchestra that played popular Central European songs. The gas chambers frequently broke down, sometimes when the victims were already inside, where they were forced to wait for hours until repairs were completed. Newly arrived trains were left for hours and even days in the summer heat. Many of those inside died of thirst, heat stroke or suffocation before the doors were opened. The trenches filled up rapidly, and new ones could not be dug quickly enough, so soon there were bodies unburied everywhere. Globoknik and Wirth visited the camp without prior notice and dismissed Ebel immediately. Wirth had been appointed General Inspector of the 3 extermination camps in August 1942, with the mission of streamlining extermination operations. In Ebel's place, he appointed Franz Stangl, the commander of Sobibor, at the beginning of September. Upon his arrival, Stangl established what he considered an orderly regime. Neatly dressed in white, he habitually carried a riding crop. He ordered the construction of a fake railway station, complete with timetables, ticket counters, and a station clock, although the hands were painted on and never moved. He established gardens, built new barracks, and set up new kitchens, all to deceive the arriving victims into believing they were in a transit camp. Stangl would watch from a vantage point between the lower and upper camps as naked prisoners were brutally driven along the road to heaven, thinking of them, as he would later confess, as cargo rather than human beings. From time to time, Stangl went home on leave to visit his wife and children. He never told his wife what his job was. She believed he was employed solely in construction work. By the end of July 1943, after 4 months of work, the task of exhuming and incinerating around 700,000 corpses that had been crudely buried in mass pits was almost complete. Fewer and fewer transports were arriving. The workers themselves realized they would be next in the gas chambers. On August 2, 1943, the prisoners set fire to part of the camp, seized weapons, and allowed nearly half of the 850 inmates in the camp to break through the perimeter fence and escape. Stangl called for reinforcements from outside. The Jewish fighters had not been able to obtain many weapons or gather much ammunition, and 350 or 400 were shot by better-armed SS guards. Only the solid brick structure that contained the gas chambers survived the fire intact. The Treblinka site was later demolished, the ground covered with grass and planted with flowers and trees, and the bricks from the gas chambers were used to build a small farm. According to a report sent to Eichmann on January 11, 1943, intercepted by British monitoring services, the number of Jews murdered in the Operation Reinhard camps by the end of the previous year totaled almost 1.25 million. A more comprehensive record prepared by Richard Koher, Himmler's Inspector of Statistics, on March 23, 1943, put the number of Jews evacuated or channeled through the camps in the east at 1,873,539, although this figure also included killings outside the Reinhard camps. Modern estimates place the total deaths in Belzec, Sobibor and Treblinka at around 1,700,000 people. The administration of horror, how the machine worked from within. A machinery of extermination cannot function on its own. It needs parts, it needs supplies, it needs personnel, it needs funding, and it needs an accounting system. Each Operation Reinhard camp was operated by a small group of between 20 and 30 SS officers or non-commissioned officers, all of them veterans of the T4 program, assisted by approximately 100 Ukrainian volunteers, the so-called Troniki, recruited from prisoner of war camps and given brief training before being assigned to the camps. This unusual organizational structure, almost exclusively composed of officers with no ordinary SS enlisted men, distinguished Operation Reinhard camps from ordinary SS installations. The process from the arrival of a convoy to the disposal of the bodies was completely standardized and assigned to specific groups of Jewish forced laborers, the Sonderkommandos. One group removed the victims from the trains. Another led them to the undressing rooms. Another collected valuables. Another cut the women's hair, which was sent to factories to stuff mattresses and produce insulating material, and sorted the clothing. Another pushed the bodies from the gas chambers into the pits or ovens. Every few months or few weeks, depending on the camp, the Sonderkommando members themselves were liquidated and replaced by new arrivals. The hair cut from the victims was sent to Germany to be used by industry. The gold extracted from the dental fillings of the dead was sent, along with the most valuable jewelry, to a sorting center in Berlin, where precious metals were melted into bars for the Reichsbank, and jewelry was exchanged in occupied or neutral countries for industrial diamonds needed for German armaments factories. Furniture and belongings left by the Jews, clothing, dishes, carpets, and much more, were confiscated by Rosenberg's office and auctioned in Germany. A report by the SS Economic Administrative Main Office estimated the total value of Jewish property confiscated in Operation Reinhard up to December 15, 1943, at nearly 180 million Reichsmarks. The railway system was indispensable. Without the railways, extermination on a continental scale was impossible. The Reich used both freight and passenger wagons for deportations, doubling the number of people who could fit in each wagon to maximize the efficiency of each journey. Transports ran as frequently as possible. The SS did not inform the Jews where they were going, how long the journey would last, or what awaited them upon arrival. No food or water was provided, even when trains had to wait for days on sidings while other trains passed. People sealed inside freight wagons suffered intense heat in summer and freezing temperatures in winter. Apart from a bucket, there was no provision for sanitary needs. Deprived of food and water, many deportees died before the trains reached their destinations. Armed guards accompanying the trains shot anyone who tried to escape. Between the autumn of 1941 and the autumn of 1944, German authorities transported millions of people by train to extermination sites in occupied Poland and the Soviet Union. After the war, despite the complicity of hundreds of railway workers, no German transport official was convicted for Nazi crimes. The administrative personnel, the lawyers who managed the Aryanization of Jewish property, the accountants who recorded confiscated assets, the engineers who designed the gas chambers, the industrialists who profited from forced labor in the concentration camps, the builders who supplied Zyklon B, operated through what could be called, in a sinister sense, an assembly line system. Each person did their part within a bureaucratic apparatus that allowed them to remain disconnected from the full consequences of their actions. No one was responsible for the whole. Someone signed the gas supply contract. Someone else drove the truck that delivered it. Someone else stored the gas in the depot. Someone else used it. The final result, mass murder, was the sum of individually banal actions. The Topfunzerne Company of Erfurt designed, patented and supplied the cremation ovens for Auschwitz. Engineer Kurt Prüfer personally visited the camp on multiple occasions to supervise the construction, testing and initial operation of the ovens. He introduced numerous small technical innovations, including the installation of heating in crematorium 2 to accelerate the dissolution of Zyklon B during cold winter days. His plans have survived and have provided historians with valuable documentary evidence of the crematorium's modus operandi. The Deutsche Reichsbahn, the German state railways, billed deportations at discounted group rates, calculated based on the number of passengers. The group fare applied to the transport of Jews to their deaths was exactly the same as that charged for school excursions. Auschwitz, the heart of the system. If Operation Reinhard represented the first phase of mass extermination, directed mainly at Polish Jews from the general government, Auschwitz represented its culmination. The camp designed to process Jews from the rest of occupied Europe, from France to Greece, from the Netherlands to Hungary. The Auschwitz camp was established in April 1940 in a former migrant labor reception center near the town of Oswiecim, Auschwitz in German, now part of the Reich. It was built to house Polish political prisoners. On May 4, 1940, Rudolf Höss, a former Freikorps fighter and camp officer at Dachau and Sachsenhausen, was appointed commander. In November 1940, Himmler informed Höss that Auschwitz would become an agricultural research station for the Eastern Territories, but the camp would expand exponentially in another direction. On September 26, 1941, Himmler ordered the construction of a huge new camp at Birkenau, Brzezinka, 2 kilometers from the main Auschwitz camp, to house Soviet prisoners of war and use them for labor projects. Up to 200,000 were to be imprisoned there, according to his plans. The discovery that would transform Auschwitz into the largest mass killing facility in history was a laboratory accident. In July 1941, a group of prisoners and their SS guards were disinfecting clothing and bedding with the chemical pesticide known as Zyklon B, whose main component was hydrogen cyanide, prussic acid, when they observed that a cat that entered the room was quickly killed by the gas. One of the guards speculated that the chemical could also be useful for killing people. The idea had been briefly considered by the T4 team in 1939, but rejected as impractical. The camp leadership now took up the idea again. In early September 1941, it was tested on about 600 Soviet prisoners of war who had been classified the previous month by a Gestapo commission as fanatical communists, together with 250 sick prisoners from the camp. They were taken to the basement of Block 11 of the main camp and gassed. Höss would later recall having observed the process. The men were crammed into the room, the doors sealed, and then Zyklon B powder was shaken in through holes in the ceiling. The heat generated by the bodies piled up in the chamber quickly turned it into a deadly gas. For a short time, he remembered, a humming sound could be heard. When the powder was thrown in, there were cries of gas. Then a great roar, and the trapped prisoners threw themselves against the 2 doors, but the doors held. All the prisoners died. On Eichmann's next visit to the camp, it was agreed to use the gas systematically. Soon there were 2 provisional gas chambers ready for operation at Auschwitz-Birkenau in buildings known as Bunker 1 and Bunker 2, the Red House and the White House. They killed their first victims on March 20, 1942. Throughout 1942 and 1943, the gassing facilities at Auschwitz-Birkenau were expanded and perfected. 4 crematoria were built, each equipped with underground gas chambers, designed in the usual pattern to resemble showers and sealed with airtight doors fitted with peepholes. Jews selected for murder were led to a disrobing room and told they were going to undergo a disinfecting shower. Members of the Sonderkommando of Jewish prisoners spoke to the victims and tried to calm them. Those who resisted undressing were helped, and those who began to scream were taken out and shot in the back of the neck. Many were not deceived. Mothers sometimes tried to hide their babies among piles of clothing. Once the victims had been led into the gas chamber, SS men positioned on the reinforced concrete roof lowered containers of Zyklon B pellets through 4 openings in wire mesh columns, which allowed the pellets to dissolve into a lethal gas as soon as the body heat of the victims had warmed the air. After about 20 minutes, the containers were removed again to eliminate the possibility of further gas escaping, while the chamber was ventilated, and a Sonderkommando of Jewish prisoners dragged the corpses into another room. They removed gold fillings and dental work, cut the women's hair, took rings, glasses, prosthetics, and other objects, and placed the bodies into elevators that carried them up to the crematorium room on the ground floor, where they were fed into the cremation ovens and reduced to ashes. The remaining bones were ground down, and the ashes were used as fertilizer or dumped into nearby forests and streams. The installations, designed and supplied by the company Topf und Söhne of Erfurt, were patented for future use by their inventor, engineer Kurt Prüfer, who traveled to Auschwitz on numerous occasions to supervise their construction, testing, and initial operation. His plans have survived and have provided historians with important documentary evidence. However, Prüfer's designs did not withstand the test of constant use. Very soon, the number of corpses became too great for the cremation ovens to handle. The brick lining began to crack, and the ovens were damaged by overheating. Before the construction of the new facilities, most of the bodies had been buried in the ground. But from September 1942 onward, the SS began to exhume them with squads of Sonderkommando prisoners and burn them on metal grates laid over trenches in the same way as in the Operation Reinhard camps. Upon arrival at the camp, the survivors of the transports were abruptly pulled from the trains by SS guards and auxiliaries with dogs and whips, shouting at them, "Out! Out! Quickly! Quickly!" They were forced to line up for a selection. The selections were carried out by SS doctors who asked a few questions of the new arrivals and gave them a brief medical examination. Children under 16, mothers with children, the sick, the elderly, and the weak were directed to the left, loaded onto trucks, and taken directly to the gas chambers after being told they were going to be disinfected there. Those who appeared physically fit and able to work were led into the camp as forced laborers. Hoss would later recall, without the slightest trace of self-awareness, "I had to see everything. I had to supervise hour after hour, day and night, the removal and burning of the bodies, the removal of the teeth, the cutting of the hair, the whole grim and endless business. I had to look through the peephole of the gas chambers and observe the actual process of death because the doctors wanted me to see it." His subordinates frequently asked him whether it was necessary to destroy hundreds of thousands of women and children. Hoss would reply that this extermination of Jewry had to be carried out so that Germany and its posterity would be freed forever from its relentless adversaries. In total, over the entire period of the camp's existence, at least 1.1 million and possibly up to 1.5 million people were murdered at Auschwitz. 90% of them, probably around 960,000, were Jews. Among them were 300,000 Jews from Poland, 69,000 from France, 60,000 from the Netherlands, 55,000 from Greece, 46,000 from Czechoslovakia, 27,000 from Slovakia, 25,000 from Belgium, 23,000 from Germany, 10,000 from Croatia, 6,000 from Italy, and around 394,000 Hungarian Jews sent to the gas chambers in a final massive wave in 1944. More than 70,000 non-Jewish Poles were killed, as well as 21,000 Roma, 15,000 Soviet prisoners of war, and up to 15,000 people of various nationalities, mainly from Eastern Europe. The ghettos, the antechamber of extermination. Between the Operation Reinhard camps and the gas chambers of Auschwitz, there was an intermediate phase that historians have called the antechamber, the ghettos. By the summer of 1942, more than 400 ghettos of varying sizes had been established throughout German-occupied Eastern Europe. In them lived more than 2 million Jews confined, and in the ghettos of Warsaw and Łódź also more than 8,000 Roma. The Warsaw ghetto was the largest. At its peak, it housed more than 450,000 people confined to an area of just 3.3 square kilometers, surrounded by brick walls 3 meters high. The density was more than 137,000 people per square kilometer, one of the highest in history. The official food rations assigned to Jews amounted to about 180 calories per person per day, when the minimum needed for survival is around 2,000. Smuggling food through the walls was punishable by death, but it was the only real means of survival. Children who had learned to slip through cracks in the walls became the main providers of food for entire families. Adam Cherniakov, the elder of the Warsaw Ghetto, president of the Jewish Council, desperately tried to maintain the illusion of normality, organizing activities for children and negotiating with the German authorities. On November 19, 1941, he noted in his diary, "In the public assistance shelters, mothers hide dead children under the beds for 8 days in order to receive a larger food ration." On July 21, 1942, the SS began arresting members of the Jewish Council in his presence, taking them hostage to ensure the cooperation of the rest. The following morning, the SS regional deportation specialist Hermann Höfler summoned Cherniakov and informed him that all Jews would be deported in consignments of 6,000 per day, starting immediately. Chernyakov had prepared a cyanide tablet to use if he received orders he could not reconcile with his conscience. One of the SS officers had told him that children were included, and Chernyakov could not bring himself to hand them over to be killed. "I am powerless," he wrote in a final letter. "My heart trembles with pain and compassion. I can no longer endure all this. My act will show everyone what must be done." Refusing to sign the deportation order, he swallowed the tablet and died instantly. Between July 23 and September 12, 1942, more than 253,000 inhabitants of the Warsaw Ghetto were taken to Treblinka and gassed. In the final week of July 1942 alone, 30,000 Jews were transported for mass extermination. The Warsaw Ghetto, which at its peak had almost 500,000 inhabitants, was reduced to 36,000 people by November 1942, all of them in some form of labor scheme. Few now doubted what awaited them. Armed resistance emerged in the ghettos. In Warsaw, on January 18, 1943, insurgents attacked German guards accompanying a deportation column, and the deportees escaped. Himmler then considered the ghetto a security threat and ordered its final liquidation on February 16, 1943. But the attack made the resistance movement widely known among the remaining Jewish population of Warsaw, who began gathering supplies and preparing for an uprising. When the SS broke in to begin the final major roundup on April 19, 1943, they were met with gunfire at several points and had to fight their way through a series of fierce street battles. The SS officer in charge of suppressing the revolt, Jürgen Stroop, described the operation as follows: "I therefore decided to carry out the total annihilation of the Jewish residential district by setting fire to all housing blocks, including those belonging to armaments factories. The Jews almost always then came out of their hiding places and bunkers. Not infrequently, the Jews remained in the burning houses until, from the heat and fear of being burned alive, they decided to jump from the upper floors, first throwing mattresses and other upholstered items from the burning houses into the street. With broken bones, they still tried to crawl along the street toward housing blocks that were not yet burning or were only partially burning." On May 16, 1943, Stroop announced the end of the operation by blowing up the main synagogue. The fighting had lasted 27 days. Approximately 7,000 Jews had been annihilated in street fighting, and up to 6,000 more in burning or blown-up buildings. The remaining inhabitants of the ghetto were sent to Treblinka. The decline of the machine, cover-up, death on the march, and the ashes. As the tide of war turned against Germany, with the catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad in January 1943 and the defeat at the Battle of Kursk in July of that year, the SS began taking measures to conceal the evidence of the crimes they had committed. The task was formidable. The Operation Reinhard camps had to be dismantled. Millions of bodies buried in ditches and mass graves in the east had to be exhumed and burned. Records had to be destroyed, and all of this had to be done in secret, using the forced labor of those who would soon also have to be killed. Paul Blobel, an SS commander who had led Sonderkommando 4A responsible for the Babi Yar massacre, was placed in charge of the cover-up operation known as Action 1005. From 1942 onward, small detachments of prisoners, called corpse units, were forced to exhume partially decomposed bodies and burn them on open-air pyres built over railway tracks. At Babi Yar, it was estimated that the workers burned around 100,000 bodies. In Chelmno, cremations began in December 1942, in Bełżec in spring 1943, in Treblinka in April 1943. Once the work was completed, the SS and police murdered the prisoners who had been forced to carry out these macabre tasks. The Operation Reinhard camps were dismantled in 1943. Bełżec, which had ceased operations in December 1942, was dismantled in spring. Treblinka, where the prisoner revolt in August 1943 effectively halted operations, was closed in autumn. Sobibor, where extermination operations ended with the prisoner revolt in October 1943, was closed at the end of the year. The sites where Bełżec and Treblinka had stood were ploughed over, landscaped and camouflaged as small farms. After the gas chambers were removed at Sobibor, the camp served for a time as an ammunition depot for the Waffen-SS. In Auschwitz, the SS continued killing those who arrived until November 1944, when, on Himmler's orders, they destroyed the extermination apparatus as Soviet forces approached. In the final days of January 1945, with the Red Army less than 50 kilometers away, the SS organized the surviving prisoners into columns and set them marching westward in sub-zero temperatures without adequate food, water, or rest. Any prisoner who could not keep pace was shot on the spot. These evacuations went down in history as death marches. The prisoners covered hundreds of kilometers during the exceptionally harsh winter of 1944 to 1945. The largest death marches took place while the Soviet army was liberating Poland, driving tens of thousands of people in the opposite direction. Soviet forces reached the gates of Auschwitz-Birkenau on January 27, 1945. They found about 7,000 surviving prisoners, most of them too ill to have been included in the death marches. They also found the ruins of the gas chambers and crematoria, which the SS had blown up in the preceding days, and they found the warehouses, tons of clothing, hundreds of thousands of pairs of shoes, and enormous quantities of human hair. Within a few weeks of liberation, half of the 7,000 survivors found alive had died. Their bodies, devastated by months or years of malnutrition, could not recover. At Bergen-Belsen, liberated by British troops on April 15, 1945, hundreds of prisoners were dying each day during the first 3 weeks after liberation. In the first month after liberation, 13,000 of the approximately 50,000 surviving inmates of the camp died. The smell of death was so dense that British soldiers entering the camp had to cover their faces. Even at the sites of the already dismantled extermination centers, forensic evidence, buried ashes and bone fragments, bore witness to the crimes committed there. The war in Europe ended with the unconditional surrender of the German armed forces to the Western Allies on May 7, 1945, and to the Soviets on May 9. On April 30, 1945, as Soviet forces approached his command bunker in central Berlin, Adolf Hitler committed suicide. The Nuremberg trials began in November 1945. Some of the main perpetrators, including Rudolf Höss, returned to Poland to be tried and executed at Auschwitz on April 16, 1947, near the house where he had lived with his family while running the camp, received sentences. Others fled and were never tried. Adolf Eichmann escaped to Argentina, where he lived under the false identity of Ricardo Clement until he was captured by Israel's Mossad in Buenos Aires on May 11, 1960. He was transferred to Israel, publicly tried in Jerusalem, and executed on May 31, 1962. His trial was one of the first moments in which the world systematically heard survivor testimony. Franz Stangl, the commandant of Sobibor and Treblinka, also fled to Brazil. He was located, extradited to West Germany, and tried in Düsseldorf. In 1970, he was sentenced to life imprisonment. He died of a heart attack in his cell on June 28, 1971, 19 hours after giving his final interview, in which he said, "My conscience is clear. I did my duty." What the 12 years of Nazi rule destroyed, human lives, culture, history, community, and collective memory, could not be rebuilt or repaired. The Jewish communities of Central and Eastern Europe disappeared, culturally and physically, except for remnants in Hungary and Romania and small groups of survivors elsewhere in the region. European Jewry had contributed for a millennium to the intellectual, cultural, scientific, and artistic life of the continent. What was lost was not recovered. What the history of this extermination machine teaches us is not only a lesson about Nazism, it is a lesson about how human beings are capable of building systems that distribute moral responsibility until it disappears into the sum of individually banal actions. About how ideology can transform the category of the other into the category of danger, and danger into the category of a problem to be solved. About how bureaucracy can rationalize the irrational. About how the silent complicity of bystanders can ultimately be as decisive as the actions of perpetrators. The machine existed. It functioned with German precision for years, and its gears were not monsters. They were people,